I'll go ahead and get started here. My name is Jeff Cody. I'm a developer with Red Hat, and kind of a segue from what Andreas was talking about, I'm going to talk about contributing to QEMU, as particularly an emphasis on new developers, at least new developers to QEMU. It could be people who have been developing for a while. Let me move the mouse off the screen here. So this whole presentation is available online, and I'll be at the end slide as well. So we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll talk a little bit about what QEMU is, not from a technical perspective of what QEMU does as a project, but more of a development overview of QEMU from the process perspective. So QEMU is an active open source project. We have a lot of contributors. I went through some of the Git history, and from the beginning of the Git history, there's roughly around 800 unique individual contributors. Looking over roughly the past year, my dates aren't exact because I prepared some of this a little while ago, but there's around 330 individual contributors over the last year. Just based off unique email addresses. And those 330 contributors were responsible for about 6,000 commits into the master branch. So that's people that got code all the way in through the whole process. So it's pretty active. Just a brief overview on the process of the development flow of QEMU. I'm sure most people in this room are familiar with it, but for people who are new, this is probably useful information. It's primarily email driven. It's not driven by, say, GitHub or something like that. Patches are sent to the email list, and the primary development list is QEMU devel. This is where all project discussion happens, whether it's discussions about bugs or patches that are sent, or just general overall project discussions. There are some other mailing lists that go along with it for kind of more niche parts of it, such as trivial patches. But as a new developer, you probably don't need to worry about those yet. Your primary concern is QEMU devel, and that's the one list that you absolutely have to be subscribed to if you want to be a QEMU developer. QEMU uses Git, and you can see where the Git hosting is at. And the QEMU development model is we have essentially a single maintainer that puts the commits into the Git master branch. And then there are sub-maintainers for different subsystems that Peter will issue or will take their pull request, and then that will eventually end up in the main branch. There's a bug tracker for QEMU available at Launchpad. And of course there's a wiki. And the wiki is a great guide. And there might be some areas where the wiki is a little bit out of date from a kind of nitty-gritty tech perspective, but for some things, especially what we're talking about here on contributing to QEMU, it's an excellent resource. So if you're new to QEMU, and you don't take anything else away from this presentation, the one thing you want to take away is that URL, because that'll pretty much tell you everything I'm telling you now, just a lot more of it. And there's also IRC, so if you need to talk to anybody in real time, there's QEMU on OFTC, and it's pretty well populated. A lot of people sit on IRC, so you can interact with people if you have real-time questions. All right, so all that said, let's get into how we contribute. All right, so here are some different ways you can contribute. We'll go into each one of these in detail, but I highlighted 4 main ways if you want to contribute to QEMU that you can contribute. You can obviously submit patches. This is what you would typically think of in developing for an open source project, is writing code, sending the code out to the mailing list, and then hopefully having it accepted and put into the Git master. but also review patches. I mean, this is something that's really needed, and as we get into a little bit of showing the process, you'll see how reviews are pretty essential to the first step in order to get patches in to QEMU. And then, of course, there's documentation. Like I said, some parts of the wiki are out of date. Some parts of the documentation is out of date, and that's a very important area where we obviously could use contributors. And of course, filing bug reports. In HIS, you don't even really need to be a developer if you want to contribute to QEMU. If you're a user and it crashes on you or doesn't do what it should do, you can file a bug report, and that's very helpful. All right, so let's get into the creating patches. This is where we are going to actually make the code. All right. So here's the overview. We'll assume with the green dot, we already have our code and our patches created and everything, and we'll get into how to get that done properly. But if we look at it from that point, once we submit our patches, the next step is it really needs to be reviewed by other contributors. And so you can see how reviewers are an essential step in this process. Anything that needs changes will be sent back, and there will be changes. It's very rare if your V1 patch is going to go through. And so it's kind of an iterative process, through this whole area here until hopefully it spits out where no more changes are needed. And then the subsystem maintainer will apply the patches to their repository and issue a pull request to Peter, and then eventually that will appear into Git master. Now, as far as the timetable for this whole process, I would allocate several weeks at least, especially you have some iterative process and reviews, and it can take a while to get people to review it. Once a sub-maintainer applies it to their branch, it might be a week or so before they issue a pull request. So there's some gate points and time delays in between those. So you shouldn't expect to be able to submit a patch and then within a few days have it in to Git master. Of course, that does happen sometimes for an urgent patch or something simple, but it's definitely not the norm. All right, so when we're creating patches, there's some traits of patches that are good patches and are likely to get through. And one of those is we want each patch to have a logical change set, and not be kind of a kitchen sink of stuff that's thrown into the patch that might not be related or might be just other stuff that's somewhat relevant but could be broken out into another patch. The more tightly controlled we have those patches, the tighter those patches are, fewer bugs, and the easier they will be to review. That makes life easier for everybody. Obviously, this should go without saying, but each patch should compile and work. But it's easy to mess this part up, especially when you're doing your development, or at least if you're like me. A lot of the stuff in my branch are not organized into logical change sets, like I said before. So I have to go back and do some rebasing and manipulating of the patches. And it's easy to create a patch series then where some of the intermediate patches might not work, although the whole series as a whole would work. But this is obviously a problem because it will break Git bisect, and that'll make everyone grumpy. And also, your patches might be partially applied. I mean, this is definitely not completely unusual. You might submit an 8-patch series, and for some reason, maybe only patches 1 through 3 are accepted. And if your patches are broken or something, then that's going to be another problem. So you can avoid this. There's make check, which will run a set of tests, and you can look at the help for that to see what test or you want to run. Or if you just run make check, it'll run everything. It'd be a little disingenuous if I said that everyone should always run make check in each patch in a large patch series, because I know a lot of people don't do it and a lot of current contributors don't do it. But the tool's there, so there's no excuse to submit patches that don't work, because you can check at least superficially some of the stuff. And there's also some tools such as git compile check that can go through and compile each iteration on the patch. And that's available on my GitHub page. Okay, and another big thing is meaningful commit messages. One thing that Marcus Armbruster mentioned a while ago is that patches with poor commit messages tend to be poor patches overall. I'm probably paraphrasing what he said, but the point still stands that if the commit message is bad, there's a good probability that the patch itself will be bad. And this is an area I think where not only new contributors need to pay attention to, but existing contributors could probably improve in this area as well. And it especially helps when we're going back and trying to figure out why a patch was put in. So we can look at the git commit and the patch, and the code will tell us what happens and how it happens, but doesn't necessarily give us the why that this patch was put in. So part of keeping your commit message meaningful is formatting in a way that's easy to parse. The first line is obviously the subject line. This is going to be what appears in email list when you email your patch out. So it's going to be the first thing that's someone's going to see if they're looking for patches to review, or if the maintainer's going to see when you CC some of the maintainers on the line. So to make it easy for them, it's a good idea to have the first word of that subject line be the subsystem that you're committing a patch for. It makes it easy for people who are using filters to filter, or just scanning the list to look for something dealing with, say, the block layer. You can look for block patches to review. And another big thing is make sure each patch is against a git master. It doesn't do any good to create patches against the latest release, because git master has surely gone past that. That might work for about an hour after the first release, but then you need to make sure you are in git master. And if you're working on a branch and you're doing revisions or patches, it's a good idea if master is advanced significantly to rebase your patches before you resend. QEMU also has a coding guidelines. It's highly encouraged that you follow coding guidelines. Matter of fact, that'll probably be reason that patches are not accepted. The guidelines are spelled out in the hacking file in the root of the QEMU Git tree. And to help you verify your patches meet the coding guidelines, there's some scripts, such as the check patch script that will check a patch that it's run against and spit out warnings or errors based off of your formatting. And then there's some other tools such as code spell, which is basically a code-aware spell checker to fix those sort of typos you might have in your commit messages or in your patch. This is an example of a good commit message, and this is Kevin's. So it's got a good subject line that identifies the subsystem and enough information to open it up and look through it. And it talks some about the why and other information, and it has his signed off by, and he includes stuff and who reviewed his patch and the reviewed by. Now, for a bad example, I didn't pull out an existing commit. I just made one up. But this is an example of bad. It doesn't start out too bad. The subject line is kind of okay. We have a subsystem up there. But once we get into the bulk of it, it doesn't really tell us anything. We have this new function that's implemented, but then we go to look at it, and we have no idea why it's implemented. It's just this chunk of code. And I'd like to say there aren't any commits in QEMU that are like that, but there are. There's some commits that add relatively large chunks of code that have commit messages like that. And especially if you're going back and you're debugging and you kind of get to this area and trying to figure out why something was added in, and you get to a commit message like that, I mean, it kind of, you don't know where to go from there. So include more information like that and not like that. So now we have our code created, hopefully, and it's in our personal Git tree, and we need to create some patches to send to the list. Well, this is an important step too, because we need to format the patches in a way that everyone's going to be able to review them and has all the necessary parts to it. So first off, sign your patch. And first, let me say, there's going to be several things in here. It's going to sound complicated, but it's all really easy if you use some of the Git tools to do this. And I'll go over that at the end of this particular slide here. So if you want to sign your patch, signed off by your name and your email address. That way, we know who it's from, and that'll show up in Git when we're looking through the commits. We want to have a subject line prefix if it's a patch that says it's a patch. Again, this is something that helps greatly with filtering. And there's some variations of what we can do with the patch line here. If you have to do iterations, you want to mark your iterations as V2, V3, V100, whatever. Hopefully not V100, but. And if you have a patch series, of course, each one should be numbered in the patch series, with 0 being reserved for the cover letter. Oh, I lied. It'll be at the end of this slide that there's the Git command on how to do this. So, for a series, you do want a cover letter. Again, the cover letter is the why for the whole series, just like your individual commit message is the why for your commit. The cover letter is the why for the entire series, and it kind of ties that series together, which will probably have several commits in it that might not be completely obvious what their purpose is, because they're probably just supporting commits. And we want it kind of shallow threaded so that you have your cover letter and then your subsequent patch emails are essentially replies to that cover letter. And that again helps with the online discussion. It helps people with mail clients with a threaded view. It kind of keeps those patches all grouped together. So the easiest way to do this is with Git format patch, or at least that's the easiest way for me to do it. I'm sure other people have some scripts or other ways that they potentially do things, but I just use Git format patch. And here's an example where we create the subject with the patch, and then we sign the patch. And this is if I'm taking all the patches on my branch up through the head. And again, there's multiple ways you could run this. A lot of people have scripts to do this automatically, but this is at least a starting point to get started from. So, at this point, we have all our patches, okay? And now we need to get the patches out to the list. This is a pretty simple step, so won't spend too much time on it. But there are some important things to keep in mind. We want to send it inline. We don't want to send these as attachments. Attachments make it harder to review and harder to apply. So keep the message inline, especially if you want reviews on your patches. You should CC the maintainers for whatever area you're touching on the patch. You can find the maintainers for what you're touching in the maintainers file. And of course, there's also a script to get the maintainers, and you just run that against each patch, and it will tell you who the maintainers are that your patch touches. Now, if you're doing a patch series, there's probably a little bit of individual preference. I tend to, if I have a patch series where individual patches have various individual maintainers, I'll tend to CC everybody on the whole series, just that way they have the context of those changes. But I know some people will just CC maintainers on the individual files that in that series that they're the maintainer for. So a little bit of preference, and I'm sure some maintainers have a preference on that, and if so, let me know at the end of the talk. So I recommend just using the Git tools again, just like in Git format patch, Git send email. Other mail agents might munge the patches, do some weird formatting, pen, carriage returns at the end, who knows. So send email is a good, safe way to do it. And again, here's an example from my history, slightly cleaned up. Sending patches QEMU devel into block layers, so I'm CCing Kevin and Stefan, who are the block maintainers. And in this case, I'm sending start at patch. I typically don't do that. I have them in a subdirectory, so I don't accidentally send out, a bunch of unrelated patches. But again, that gives you the idea, and it gives you something to go from in order to send out patches. So now we sent the patches out to the list. We're completely done, right? We don't have anything else to worry about. They're eventually going to appear and get master, and we're going to be happy. Well, no, that's not the case. So at this point, there's still a lot left to be done in order to get our patches all the way through. We need to care for these patches. We don't want to just fire and forget and assume that everything's going to be okay. Hopefully what happens is you're going to get reviews, you're going to get comments, and you're going to get things you need to fix. And one thing I should say to new contributors to QEMU, or people who are maybe intimidated by the processes, this can be an intimidating step, right? Or it's going to be a step where you might feel discouraged if you send a patch and you get some comments saying, this doesn't comply with the coding style, this isn't how we do this, and you get all these kind of comments that might seem like they missing the larger point of your patch or something, but it's very important for us to have code that looks the same and applies, that adheres to the coding style. So the fact that you got reviews and you got comments is actually a very positive thing. That means that we want your code and we're trying to help you get it in. So don't be discouraged at all at that step. You should be encouraged at that step. And hopefully the review critiques come across that way, but it doesn't always. There's obviously, there's cultural and there's language barriers. It's a large, international team. So just be mindful of that. If you do get a review, which hopefully you do, make sure you address it. There might be feedback in there that you don't agree with, and especially from a, technology perspective and a development perspective. And so feel free to discuss that with, the reviewer. You don't have to just automatically accept that, but be ready to back up and defend why you have that position. And definitely don't just get a bunch of reviews and then send another patch having ignored the previous reviews. So if you're not going to make a change, make sure you're able to articulate why. And during this discussion, you always want to use reply all. QEMU is an open source development, and in particular, we're an open source development project where the development happens out in the open. So reply all to everybody, that make sure everybody can contribute to discussion. Now, what is likely to happen is you'll send a patch out, and all you're going to hear is crickets. You're not going to hear anything. Don't despair at that point. That's perfectly normal. People are busy, and it's a busy mailing list, and your patch got buried in the mailing list or just didn't catch someone's attention or whatnot. So if you don't get a review, just wait a few days and then send out a ping. Reply to your patch, or if it's a patch series, do a reply all. Reply to the cover letter, but yeah, make sure it's reply all. Another thing that might be useful is if you can find a non-maintainer, because maintainers are really busy. If you can find a non-maintainer that is familiar in that area of code, someone that perhaps has a lot of commits in that code area, see if they'll review the patch for you, because that'll definitely get things along. Once someone starts reviewing it, other people will jump on and review it. It keeps it up at the top of the list, so to speak. And it gives some confidence to the maintainers and tells them, this is something that they should look at. So that outlines kind of the process of getting your patches sent out to the mailing list and hopefully in to get master. But another big way to contribute is to review patches. And this is obviously a critical step. Some steps to keep in mind if you are reviewing patches is that you want to focus on the code and not the submitter, right? We're critiquing the code, not critiquing the coder. And you can do your review on multiple levels. You might find yourself doing a review in an area that is not your specialty, but you can still do a review based off of code syntax. I mean, anybody can do that, and that's still very helpful. Obviously, if you can review the logic and the function and what it's doing, that's even better. It's definitely something that's needed. And challenge yourself to find bugs. Any bugs that you can find during the review stage are bugs that don't end up in Git master, and that's obviously desirable and kind of the whole point of the review. But we would definitely want to avoid, nitpicking. Well, I would have done it slightly different, even though it adheres to the coding standards and it's correct. We want to avoid that sort of bike shutting if possible. And it's easy to fall into that, and I think we are all guilty of that at some point. And if you do review something and you're satisfied, indicate it. It doesn't do any good if you review it in isolation and then don't let anyone know that you reviewed it. It doesn't necessarily help anybody. So to indicate that you've reviewed it, just do a reply all to the patch, with a review by. And on the series, you can obviously just do this on the cover letter if you want, or you can do individual patches in the series. All right, so sometimes bugs will emerge in the code. And it's useful to have users file bug reports. So some good tips if you're going to contribute to QEMU by filing bug reports is to make sure that the bug still exists on QEMU master. If you notice a bug in your OS distribution, that's more than likely a QEMU version that is significantly behind QEMU master. So before you file a bug report on QEMU, it would be great if you could check that against the Git master to see if it still occurs. If it doesn't still occur after you check it against Git master, you probably still need to file a bug report, but probably with your OS distribution and not with QEMU itself. Because they're either on an older version or some of their tweaks to it may have caused a bug. And definitely try to provide all the relevant information that goes into the bug report. Some things like QEMU command line, that's really useful, and it's sometimes something that's missing from bug reports because you might be using a management tool and you're not aware of the command line. But if at all possible, try to reproduce the bug if you can with QEMU with the command line. If you can't, it doesn't mean you can't file a bug report, but it is greatly appreciated if you can. And let us know how you're using QEMU. If you're using it with libvirt or through overt or through OpenStack, that's other critical information to help us, figure out what's going on in that bug. And indicate what you were doing when it happened. There might be things you were doing either in the guest or in the host that would be relevant. If you're doing something with heavy I/O or you're doing something with heavy networking, that could be information that might be relevant to figuring out what's going on in the bug. And especially if you're issuing commands, QMP or HMP or QAPI commands, let us know what commands you're issuing. Even if it's not necessarily centered right around when the bug happened, those commands might have a ripple effect. And if you have any information in your host system logs, obviously sanitize it to remove any sensitive information, but that's stuff that could be useful in the bug report as well. Also, let us know what you're running it on, not just your OS distribution, but on a host OS, CPU architecture, that's useful information. And let us know what the guest is as well. Essentially, as you can tell, more info is better than too little information. So whatever you can put in a bug report, it'd be great. And if it starts out with too much information, that can always be winnowed down later. So we've gone over those first three areas of contributing. This last area, documentation, is an area that it's not always a strong point of developers, but it's an area that is definitely needed. So there's lots of places you can go to contribute documentation. You can go to the wiki. Like I said before, the wiki sometimes gets out of date. We often like to do our documentation in our code and our code only. But that means some of the stuff on a wiki could use some love and care. So that'd be a great place to go. And if you need an account, just ask in QEMU Devel. Accounts were, account creation was disabled a while ago to control some spamming on the wiki. There's lots of docs actually in the QEMU Git repo under the docs directory. Hopefully some of those are up to date, but I know there are some that are not. So that's a good place to go. One, to find information, but two, to update the information, particularly with new features that come along that don't always get reflected in the documentation in the docs directory. QAPI is a big part of QEMU on controlling it. And there's essentially documentation in the JSON files and the QMP command files. So that's another good place you can go if you want to try to update some documentation. You can look through, and this is kind of a two-part thing. One, this is a good source of information to update the docs in the Git repo, because this is most likely up to date, more so than either this or that. So if you want to bring some of the first two up to date, this is a good area to check for some information. But it's quite possible that some of the comments in this might be out of date, although we're typically pretty good about catching up before those get committed in, since it's part of the commit. But there are some man pages, and that's another great area to focus on. You can update the man pages to make sure that all the QEMU features are reflected properly in the man pages, and any limitations are documented in those man pages as well. So, are there any questions? I imagine most people here are well-established QEMU contributors. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, again, this presentation is available here. And of course, it'll be online with the recordings and the slides for KVM Forum. All right, thank you.